We are underway. Glenn Loury here, Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv. I am professor of economics and of international and public affairs at Brown University. The Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs sponsors Glenn Show. And I'm here with Robert Woodson, Senior Robert Woodson, who is founder and president of the Woodson Center, formerly the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, who is a old and dear friend of mine, a community activist, I believe I could say, a winner decades ago of one of those MacArthur Prize fellowships, a man who works with grassroots organizations throughout the country to try to advance empowering people, to try to advance the well-being of struggling people in this country. And Bob, welcome to the Glenn Show.
Pleased to be here, Glenn, as always.
Did I get anything wrong in your intro, man?
No, that's good enough. You know, like Apostle Paul said, who were you before you were baptized? That's what's important.
Okay, well, I want to just, if you don't mind, amplify that introduction just a little bit by saying that I'm honored to have you with me this morning, that you are a great man. You are an African-American and an American leader who's been around for a while and who's got a lot of wisdom and a lot of experience. And I just feel that it's a good thing to be able to talk to you and talk to you in public about the issues of the day. I should mention right off the bat that the Woodson Center has been a leader in developing a robust voice in the public education debate engendered by the 1619 Project of the New York Times on the slavery and the American founding, through the instrument of what you have inaugurated, which is the 1776 Project at the Woodson Center. And I definitely want to give you an opportunity to tell people a little bit about that. But if you just bear with me for a moment, okay? I want to take the opportunity at this critical time. We have a COVID-19 epidemic. It has mobilized the country in an effort to try to stem the tide of this invasion, this viral invasion, and this public health emergency. It has created profound tension and distress on our institutions. It is killing people. That must not go unmentioned. And it has raised, with an election looming, a presidential election, some of the most contentious and difficult kind of back and forth. And I just think it's valuable to look to our elders. Excuse me, Bob.
I'm glad to be able that you could say that.
And I'll just stop. Why don't you tell people, please, a little bit about the work that you have been doing at the Woodson Center, and then perhaps a little bit about the 1776 Project, and I can chime in with a question from now and then. And then I would like us to spend some time before we're done talking about the state of African-American people, the nature of the struggle, the character of leadership, and the narratives that are abroad in the land in terms of how we Black people are thinking about our situation. I don't know if that's too much to try to cover in one conversation.
Well, I think in the interest of time, let me just give you a 4-minute snippet on my background, and I think that's just important. I was born in Philadelphia, and my dad died when I was 9, leaving my mother with a 5th grade education to raise 5 children in a troubled neighborhood. It was troubled, but it was also a neighborhood that had 90% of homes with a man and a woman raising children.
What year was that, Bob, if I may ask?
1937. I was born in 1937. I just turned 83. Delighted to be able to say that.
Praise God, as we used to say, Bob.
Yeah.
Because everybody is not going to get there. Let's just be clear about that.
No, but also I just think I was, so given that kind of background, I had to rely on my friends. I had a group of about 6 friends who are close to this day. 3 of us are no longer here. But when they graduated from high school before me, I was left unaffiliated. In my neighborhood, you don't grow up like that. So I quit and went into the military at 17. But in there, I found myself, they trained me. I was in the space program, and I went to got my GED in the military and came out, and my form of affirmative action was driving 30 miles a day to a full-time job and going to college full-time. And so that was my affirmative action. Thank God I didn't come along to affirmative action. But as a consequence, I got involved, finished undergraduate school, and working in a juvenile jail, locked behind 3 doors, with 65 juveniles in there from gang murder to truancy. But they were the same kids I grew up with. And so I kind of fell in love and had a kind of burning bush experience. 6 of those boys I would have adopted if I had the means to do so. So they were there because of their circumstance, but there were some there because of their values. So long story short, I graduated, got involved in master's in social work, and then I went to work in the foster care system and saw how that system was destroying children. Got involved in the civil rights movement, having led demonstrations in Westchester, Pennsylvania, the home of Baird Rustin. But in doing so, I left the movement, man, very disappointed following the death of Dr. King, when I realized that a lot of people who suffered most didn't benefit from the change, that low-income Blacks were used as the bait for attracting programs and relief. But when the benefits came, it went to middle-class Blacks like myself and not to the people in whose name it was demanded.
Okay, let me just interrupt for a minute, Bob. You were telling us about, your background. I want you to continue. I just want to pause for a moment and ask, because these years in the 1960s, the years of Great Society and equal opportunity programs, these are formative. This is a formative period. The beginning of the expansion of welfare, and a lot of people would say that welfare dependency was not a healthy thing for the social fabric of the African American community. The beginning of the transformation of the civil rights movement from a universalist, I have a dream speech kind of movement into a Black Power movement. And, I was going to ask you what you thought about Malcolm X, how he factored in these years, because these are the very years when his ministry was powerful. And because I think that relates, and excuse me for interrupting you, I want to hear your story about the contemporary time, because some of those same fissures I think I see in African American leadership and voice, even in the present day. So, how'd you react to the radicals of your time? I'm talking about the Black radicals, the Stokely Carmichaels.
Well, there was a time that I was a part of them, but what was very important at that time, Glenn, is the quality of the debate within the Black community. We had Dr. King, I Have a Dream. You had Malcolm X, who was challenging. You had the Black Panther Party, who were insurrectionists. You had the Republic of New Africa that said we should have a separate state within. Now, there was vigorous debate within the Black community. Even the civil rights movement fractured on the issues of whether we should engage in civil disobedience. The lawyers in Atlanta believed that we should seek redress through the courts, but the students at Greensboro said, no, we want to demonstrate. And so there was a lot of fracturing, healthy fracturing of the community as we sought our way forward. When Dr. King merged the civil rights movement with the peace movement, he was called a communist by Carl Rowan, the liberal journalist for the Washington Post. But Dr. King prevailed. And so, but there was rigorous debate, but there's also standards of behavior as well. You could not be a participant in the civil rights movement if you were drunk or if you were rude to people. We had standards of conduct. The reason that Rosa Parks was chosen is because she had middle-class values. But what I witnessed, Glenn, that disappointed me, that caused me to leave, was on the whole issue of forced busing for integration. I felt it was wrong. I felt it was anti-Black. And I felt that we should be, I left on that. But also I led demonstrations outside of a pharmaceutical company. And when they desegregated, they hired 9 Black PhD chemists. And when we asked these brothers and sisters to join us, they said, we got these because we were qualified, not because of what you all did. So I realized that there was a huge class split in the Black community. And so after that happened 2 or 3 times, I left the movement. And then I watched how our Black politicians morphed into, our Black civil rights leaders became Democratic politicians at a time when the poverty program was expending $22 trillion. So they became mayors and administrators of those funds.
Okay,
And
okay.
that's when I saw the corruption occur.
Excuse me again for interrupting, and I just want to, there's so much information that's coming out. You left, okay? That's the first thing. You left the movement and struck out in a new direction. You were on the other side of the busing debate from the civil rights community for reasons that you thought even had to do with being anti-Black. You saw a class issue in the civil rights struggle, as you came to see that people on the streets were not always the ones getting the benefits. People in the suites were the ones that were getting the benefits.
Absolutely.
And you saw a bureaucracy emerge, institutionalized, dug in kind of profession of advocating on behalf of Black people, but not really being accountable to Black people.
Absolutely. There's right on my wall, I have a framed headline from the Washington Post, October 29, 1965, written by reporter Bill Raspberry. And the banner headline is, "Poor Negroes are not benefiting from the gains of the civil rights movement." And that has driven me from that time to today. And that is profoundly true, because of the $22 trillion spent over 50 years on the poverty programs, 70 cents of every dollar goes not to the poor, but those who serve the poor. They ask which problems are fundable, not which ones are solvable. Another fact, Glenn, only 2 out of 10 whites with college education works for government. 6 out of 10 Blacks with college education works for government. So our Black middle class is anchored in the public sector that is responsible for and depends upon having large numbers of dependent people to serve.
Oh, okay, well, hold on just a minute, Bob. So you know this, when I was coming up, working at the post office was one of the best jobs that a Negro could have. That the impact on Black communities of professionals, social workers, teachers, lawyers who work for the government has been very significant. You can't possibly be indicting public employment across the board with respect to its impact on the African-American community, can you?
It's not a matter of indicting, it's a matter of facing the reality of what it is. I don't care how compassionate you may be about helping people, but if your career depends upon having someone else dependent, Glenn, that is a reality we must discuss. You don't have to attribute any blame for anybody, but we need to face it and say, what can we do that will ensure that middle class people make a decent living, but how can we do it in such a way it's not harmful to other people?
Well, I'm okay with that. I'm fine with that. I mean, but look how you turned the tables. You made the fact that I'm trying to help the homeless into an indictment of my motive. You've now said that because I get a salary for helping the homeless, I'm dependent on their being homeless. And I don't think that's fair. It may or may not be true in any particular instance, but the very fact that I get my salary from helping people doesn't mean that I have no interest in seeing them set free from their condition.
Absolutely. In other words, what I'm saying, that we are locked in an institutional arrangement that causes good, compassionate people to do bad things with regard to their neighbors. That we don't have to attribute denigrating them for it, but we need to face it and say what it is. If, for instance, if a child comes into foster care, and that only 3% of these kids have problems, psychological dysfunction. But as they move from home to home by policy and they deteriorate, the reimbursement rate goes up. And so the more we deteriorate, the more valuable they are as a commodity. That's a reality, Glenn, that we've got to face without trying to attribute blame to anybody. But we can't solve the problem if we don't face it. But I really think, look, I worked inside of the Urban League for 5 years. This is something no one's ever reported. Nixon gave the Urban League national $93 million when he was president to address poverty. $93 million. Think about that in today's dollars. The Ford Foundation, Carnegie, Rockefeller Brothers also contributed massively to that movement. And then ask yourself what happened. I worked there at the end, and I can tell you what happened.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are a lot of instances where money was thrown at problems and nothing really came of it, especially coming out of the late 60s and the early 70s. But I'm wondering how, what you're talking about, I was just cataloging, and as you were talking about your career, you know, your how you came to where you are, that you broke from the civil rights movement, that you were very uncomfortable about busing because you thought it kind of undermined African-American autonomy. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that you became very suspicious of the welfare state. So where are you now? What has this come to? What does this come to?
Let me just make this point, because that's in 1973, I was sent by the Urban League to Boston to monitor the case of busing when that was being debated before Judge Garrity, right? Judge Garrity asked the people suffering the problem in Mattapan, what do they want? There were months of meetings. The grassroots leaders and parents said, we want to strengthen neighborhood schools, give us a disproportionately more money per capita so we can improve our schools and create centers of excellence. But the lawyers told Judge Garrity, the middle class guys from Harvard and other, who did not have their children on their buses, told Judge Garrity, to hell with what the neighborhood people want, bust them. Not a damn scholar or lawyer had their children on those buses. It was low-income people. And white parents said, bust them into these schools, they'll graduate as dumb as our kids, because you are moving them from a superior black high school into an inferior white school in the name of integration. I debated this before the New York Bar Association with Julius Chambers, Harvard graduate, lawyer, a fine man.
Yeah, the late Julius Chambers. He's passed away.
Yeah, a honorable man. Julius and I debated this before the New York Bar Association. And I said, Julius, if we have two scenarios, A, where there's an all-black school, there's a presence of educational excellence, and school B is where there's integrated and diminished excellence, where should we send our children? He said, to school B. I said, then you and I have no more to debate. You see, so what?
Okay, hold on. I gotta stop you, Bob. I gotta stop you. Because it's very rich, very rich. I gotta ask you this, okay? Because Justice Clarence Thomas, all right, I'm talking now about the US Supreme Court, because I have to link this to the actual things that are happening on the ground, okay?
Okay.
There's a philosophical debate amongst African Americans. It goes back a long way. It goes all the way back to Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and all that kind of stuff. I know you know all about that. I'm not going to try to lecture here. What I want to say is what you have said just now about the capacities of Black communities, about the anti-democratic character of the elite-led voice of African-American advocacy in the public sphere, and about excellence amongst Black people. This is the kind of thing that has made Justice Clarence Thomas, who has said these things in Supreme Court opinions affecting the laws of this country, into a pariah amongst many people. And I want, if you allow me, to ask you to speak to that.
What I'm talking about, and I can tell you by illustration, is
I'm asking you if you agree or not with Justice Clarence Thomas about these things, because it's the US Constitution that we're talking about.
Okay, what specifically you said about Thomas? That's what I'm asking.
Well, you know how his jurisprudence has been very skeptical of affirmative action, very skeptical of the use of racial categories for busing, and moreover, how his life story, I mean, come on. You want to talk about the 1619 Project and the 1776 Project, so you want to talk about America, about America's institutions, and you want to talk about Black excellence. So now I'm talking about the longest serving justice on the US Supreme Court, who is an African-American out of the Sea Islands off of Georgia, coming up through his own particular background, exactly in the same cohort as you, voicing the same things as you were voicing. And I've got you cornered. I've got you cornered, Bob, because my ultimate point is that there are political implications. I'm talking about partisan political implications of your philosophical position.
Let me tell you something, Glenn. When I took a position against forced busing for integration in Westchester, Pennsylvania, the same people that you're quoting said to me, well, Bob, your position is consistent with that of the Klan and the John Birch Society. And
that's what they say about Justice Thomas.
Okay, but my thing is, just because if I like classical music and Hitler does, am I supposed to not like classical music? You either stand for the truth or you don't. What I am saying is that I have seen affirmative action exploited by middle-class Blacks all of my professional life. When I was with the Urban League and all of these contracts came down where affirmative action, where I had contractors tell me that there's an Alaskan pipeline, they have to they gave it to a Black. He takes 10% of it and then contracts it to the white firm. He walks away a millionaire. Meantime, Blacks are not working. I can take you all day through other programs that were supposed to benefit the Black community, but it only benefited a few who exploited in the names of their people, Glenn. I can sit here and
I agree with that. I agree with that, Bob. You can't actually tell me a whole lot about that because I know an awful lot about it. Because as you know, I have been living amongst these Negroes that you're talking about my entire professional life.
Yeah.
Okay. I know personally hundreds of the people that you're talking about.
Right.
Every time I go to a faculty meeting, I'm sitting across from one of them.
Mm-hmm, I see.
Okay?
Yeah, but
every time I show up at the Ford Foundation for a committee, I'm dealing with them.
Yeah.
Okay. So you know, the Harvard Business School, the Stanford Business School are overrun with these people. The educational bureaucracy, the associates provost for diversity and inclusion, the Afro-American and African-American and Africana studies departments that have proliferated around this country. I know these people. So no, I'm not saying there's not an issue. I'm not saying that there's not an issue. I was trying to get you onto a different kind of ground though, because what I'm saying is you show up on Tucker Carlson. You put your stuff in the Hill. You have an affiliation with the Heritage Foundation. Now, these are political actors in an ongoing struggle. And I could even go to the point that Donald Trump is president of the United States. I'm not asking you how you vote. That's not what I'm asking you. That's not what I'm asking you. What I'm saying is, what about your people, the future of your people, and the political dynamic in which we're embedded right now?
Okay.
And where do you come down?
Well, where I come down is this. Everyone has their reference groups. My reference groups are the 2,500 grassroots leaders in these 39 states who are in those drug-infested, crime-ridden neighborhoods. What they believe about what I said means more to me than any damn body else. And as long as my grassroots leaders who are suffering directly the consequence of the neglect, they are asking why when they're being told that liberal democratic politicians who've been running these cities for 40 years, why our conditions continue to deteriorate. The great promise of the civil rights movement is elect us and we will be better than white folks. And I'm saying that many of them, you never hear anyone talking about those Blacks who get convicted for I call treason, moral treason against their people by stealing money that's supposed to go to help. For Kwame Kirkpatrick in Detroit and 34 of his fraternity brothers who are sitting in prison, but that's not a national scandal.
I didn't even know it. Are you telling me I knew Kirkpatrick, Detroit?
34
of his fraternity brothers?
Of his fraternity brothers and friends and consultants, a whole group of them convicted by an all-Black jury, sentenced by a Black federal judge.
That should have been the subject of a New Yorker expose. There should be books on the shelves written by people who are trying to unearth the sociological and political foundation of that. If you had dozens of fraternity brothers, you had a widespread, systematic, organized enterprise of
Read it. Read
And,
it.
you know, I mean, and that's not, if that's a fact about contemporary African American life. I didn't even know it, man. I'm
But
ashamed to admit that I didn't know.
it's even worse. What happened was one of his fraternity brothers took those pension funds and misused them to the point where there are thousands of Black city employer elderly people retired who a lot of their pension funds went to this, but that's not a national scandal.
Yeah.
William
Okay. They
Jefferson
use
in
the
the mid
finances
50s.
of the city of Detroit as a personal piggy bank for their fraternity to engage in whatever. Okay.
Read it. It's
Yeah.
a matter of public, but it's never a public discussion in the Black community. William Jefferson, at the time of Katrina, and 9 members of his family were indicted for stealing money that was supposed to go to poor Blacks. But
Yeah,
that's
I know.
not a national scandal.
Okay, but you know what they're going to say, man. You know what they're going to say. They're going to say white people do it too, and why are you making a big deal out of Black people doing it?
Well, because if you're going to run for office, then call it truth and advertise. Say, I promise to be no more honest than white folks were.
Okay, let me take you back to the grassroots leaders.
I promise you, I will be no better than the white folks who play something. See, practice truth and advertising and say, now vote for me anyway, because I'm Black.
Okay, Bob,
That.
I want to shift this back to the grassroots organizers, because this is about what the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise and the Woodson Center are about. And you're talking about hundreds upon hundreds of people around the country with whom you have relationship and a working relationship and are a basis for your identity. You say you go back to where you identify from, and those are people to whom you are accountable. So I want you to tell us a little bit about that.
Well, because many of the grassroots leaders that I have been helping, they are solution oriented. They don't care about the politics. And so what we have been doing is taking some of those old values that help Black people prosper in the time of slavery and discrimination. We hear a lot from 1619 that somehow the problems that Blacks are facing today of out of wedlock births and violence in their neighborhood is somehow a legacy of slavery and discrimination. This is a lie, because when whites were at their worst, Blacks were at their best. And I gave.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that let's take Chicago, in the Brownsville section of Chicago. You know what that's like today. Well, back in 1929, in the city of Chicago, in the Black community, we had 731 Black-owned businesses. We had 100 million in real estate assets. We had an out-of-wedlock birth that was just 15%. And I could take you to Durham, all around the country, where there were islands of economic and social excellence in the Black communities. When we were denied access to hotels, we built our own. And when we were
Are you saying there's not Black excellence in Black communities today, Bob?
No, you go look in Chicago. Go look in some of those same communities where there was. The question was back in 1929.
Well, I was born, excuse me, I was born in Chicago. I know exactly what you're talking about. And the Black community has expanded from that area around Brownsville on the near south side into the vast suburbs around the south side of Chicago. So you can't identify the Black community, quote unquote, with the problems of Brownsville today.
No, I'm saying to you that those centers of excellence went down in the 60s. They survived for 100 years after slavery. I'm just saying to you, for 100 years after slavery, Black families were intact throughout all that period. Our elderly people could walk safely in our communities in the 1930s to 1940s without being fear of being mugged by their grandchildren. Our marriage rate during the 10 years of the Depression was highest of any other group. The communities were safe because of the moral character, the Christian values that are being practiced. My point, Glenn, if we were able to achieve moral and spiritual excellence and our communities were safe in a time where racism was enshrined in law and we had no political representation, if we did it then, the question is, why can't we do it today?
Okay, let me respond to that. First of all, let me say I'm profoundly in sympathy with what you've been saying. That's my personal view. But my responsibility here at the Glenn Show, Bob, is to respond to that. So let me respond to that. Yes, if you were to just draw a historical chart, you would see that the out of wedlock birth rate is higher, and the proportion of kids living with two parents is lower, that the influence of religious values is weakened, that the level of violence and criminality is greater, etc. You would see that. And yes, the timing will line up with what you say, which is that in the 1920s and the 1930s, there was a different sensibility in African-American social life than what it is that you see, especially amongst the poor. The timing will line up, but the problem is, with your nostalgia, excuse me, I'm being the devil's advocate here. The problem with your nostalgia is that you can't push on a string. That is to say, here's the metaphor. I've got a fabric and it's unraveling, and someone pulls on the string, and the more they pull, the more the fabric unravels until the structure is no longer there. Let's suppose you're right about the Black community, quote unquote. And I'm going to leave aside all of the things that you're not analyzing about what is also going on in the world. And let's just suppose that you're right about the Black community and the string has been pulled on. Then, by my account, you answer your own question. Why can't we be like what we were? Because you can't push on a string and reweave that fabric, Bob. Wishing doesn't make it so.
But Glenn, it starts with the expectation. Right now, all we're doing is saying to inner city Black communities, exempting them from responsibility. It starts in your mind and in your heart. There are all kinds of responses to oppression. There are classic three. You can either identify with the oppressor, you can just, or you can respond by saying, I am not going to be what they are demanding of me. And the third is to acquiesce and just die. And but it starts with your attitude. And our forebears were faced with, we aren't being lynched every day the way we were back then. Even in the face of those horrible conditions, oppressive laws, redlining, we still own property. We still able to raise responsible families. And so your attitude starts with the expectation. But if you're
we do own property. African Americans are much richer now than they were 50 or 75 years ago.
Glenn, I'm saying to you, there are two standards, which is troublesome to me. All of Nicole Hannah Jones and all of those people who are writing in 1619, most of them do not live in these troubled communities, and yet they have a different level of expectation for their own children. She even said that her husband and her can provide whatever is missing in their environment. That is a expectation. But I find it troubling when we say to the Black community that your problems are all external and you are exempt from any personal responsibility for controlling your own behavior, even with this pandemic. Reverend Barber and Cole Jones was on MSNBC. The whole time they talk about systemic racism, inequality. Somehow those were the reasons you have the disproportionate number of Blacks who are dying from it. They refuse to apply the same standards to the Black community as they're applying to the rest of the country. We're saying the way that you can control the pandemic is through personal choices that you make. You have got to control where you go, how you interact with people. But if you were to take the
okay, Bob, let me interrupt. I hear you, and the audience hears you, man. Again, pushing back because that's my job, but also I think I really do want to push back a little bit. There's two things here. One of them is, what do we do as Black people? And you're right. The constant litany of helplessness, of learned helplessness that comes from these people that makes us baubles at the end of a string, pushed by the historical forces this way or that, and having no free agency or capacity to make our own futures and our own lives is complete bullshit. It's extremely dangerous, and it must be opposed. I don't want anybody to misunderstand me about that. But there are two things here. One of them is, what should Black people do? How should Black people be? What is our vision? Who are we? And at the end of the day, if you ask me, that's a spiritual question, okay? Whether you ascribe to this religion or that, that's a question about meaning, about the deepest existential questions that confront a reflective human being and a reflective person of African descent. There's that question, and I agree with you about that. And this is why I was asking you about Justice Thomas, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but there's also the political question. The political question is not what should we African Americans do, it's what should we Americans do. Now, you cannot begrudge Ben Barber or Hannah Jones for wanting to put a thumb on the scale on behalf of their people in the political conversation about what should be done. Now, the issue then would become, because they're addressing themselves to the entire country, what is to be done, okay?
Okay.
Now, if you've got something better to suggest about that than Hannah Jones and Barber, that should be the thing that we should be talking about.
Okay, but and I'd love to. Yeah, what they're advocating is the same thing that has failed for 40 years. Just vote Democratic, ask for more government programs, ask for reparations. You got millionaire football players who 7 years after they leave the league are broke. And you're going to tell us the problems of out-of-wedlock birth and violence can be solved by giving more government programs or reparations? No. My solution is to go around what we do around the country, go into these drug-infested, crime-ridden neighborhoods and find healthy antibodies. The sickest part of the body, Glenn, attracts the strongest antibodies. What the Woodson Center does is go in these communities, find grassroots leaders who have the moral authority to be spiritual and moral mentors to their peers, and they create islands of excellence within. I have one that I tell people, go on 60 Minutes and type in Bertha Gilkey 60 Minutes. You will see an example that we helped create. And there are about 5 or 6 other models of how self-development can occur from within the communities, reducing teen pregnancy, stopping the violence, transforming and redeeming people by the hundreds. So what we need to do as a nation is look for these strengths, islands of excellence, and invest in them. Some of you scholars need to show up and ask questions about capacity and not just do failure studies, but ask how we need to be. There should be a center at a university on the study of resilience, and we need to have study of resilience and stop just talking about the pathology of people.
Okay, so okay. With great respect, because that sounded really, really good about empowering people, about finding antibodies in places of despair, about resilience, and about being able to deal with these problems effectively on the ground. That sounded really, really good. But here's the thing. I mean, we got a Department of Health and Human Services. We got a Department of Housing and Urban Development. We got a state and a city agency for this or for that. We've got TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. We've got Medicaid, a massive expansion of resources. If anybody in the center or left becomes president or gets control of the Congress, into healthcare for the disadvantaged, et cetera. Okay, we've got an educational blob. I mean, a massive institutional. We got tens upon tens of thousands of teachers in a very powerful union. We got, et cetera. Okay, this is what we got. How do you get from where we got to where you want to be without politics? You cannot just preach. I want to know what the program is.
Well, the program, as far as I'm concerned, again, that we have to, that's why I start with the name enterprise in my name, in our name, because I believe that the principles that operate in our market economy ought to apply to the social economy. Now, And so innovation, I think George Bernard Shaw asked the question, must a Christ die in torment at every age to save those that lack imagination? And Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge. What we need is a little more imagination. 60% of Apple's income comes from a product that did not exist 7 or 8 years ago. And it changed the face of the country. We need to look at that same level of innovation. If I can find a way of stopping gang members from terrorizing their communities and turn them into ambassadors of peace, so they go from 53 gang deaths in 2 years to 0 gang deaths in 12 years, that to me is tantamount to a major breakthrough. And we were able to do this. But what we ought to do is in the marketplace, if it was a product, we would have rushed in, everyone would have invested in it, and we would have taken this to the whole country the way Apple did the iPhone. But so this is how we have got to think about it. There's another group, Glenn, that I bet you no one ever studied, United House of Prayer. They are small areas where there are groups of people that I bet you these are all blue collar folks, Daddy Gracie Church. They own the land in the inner city. They're not gentrified out because they purchased that land and engaged in the kind of practices that our forebears used to do. So they are contemporary examples of the entrepreneurial spirit that existed 100 years ago is still in practice today. But again, no one from your community ever shows up at the doors to ask how are they able to produce kids who are not having children, even though they're blue collar folks. How is it that they own land in gentrified areas? But here, now this is another piece too, going back to what we said earlier. Washington, D.C. has been controlled by Black politicians for 40 years. 19,000 low-income Blacks have been gentrified out of the city in the last 20 years. How is that happening? Why aren't they held accountable for that? But no, we're talking about systemic racism, injustice. That's because I'm telling you, this is such a superficial issue when it comes to issues like economic development, gentrification. You know, it's almost that we are playing games with ourselves, talking about injustice and racism and systemic racism. I mean, this is such a superficial kind of issue.
Let me now, can I, if I may, since this is the Glenn Show, I'm going to take a little time, react a little bit. And this is not critical. This is affirmation. I'm in so much profound agreement with you, and I want to give my view. And my view is that social capital is important. This is where I think you're coming from ultimately in my theory, in my idea. Institutions are important. Informal institutions are important. The family is a fundamental starting point. The community, the neighborhood structures, churches, community organizations, these are fundamental. Finding leadership at the grassroots, organizing people at the grassroots to empower them, this is fundamental. Development is fundamental. In other words, the outcomes that we see, whether it's incarceration or teenage pregnancy or dropping out of school or getting HIV, are not just things that fall on people by willy-nilly, neither are they the result of some magic ray coming out of a racist ray gun. They are the results of the behaviors of the people involved, and those are things for which those people are responsible. The fact of injustice, of unfairness, which you are not denying in the least has afflicted Black people, does not remove that responsibility. And I could go on in that vein, but personal responsibility is important. You're worried that the racial grievance industry, I know that's a phrase that you probably have coined, but people will know what I'm talking about when I say it. There's the intellectual and journalistic part of it, of which a Hannah Jones or a Ta-Nehisi Coates is an aspect. There's the bureaucratic and professionalized part of it, of which all of these middle-level people working in these various social service bureaucracies whom you've excoriated belong and whatnot. profoundly ineffective, hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions of dollars poured down a rat hole without effect, without getting to the root of the thing. And I'd add to all of this that the intellectual environment is impoverished, that the editorial pages at the newspapers don't get it, that the universities don't scratch the surface of doing what they should be doing in a responsible way in dealing with these problems, that the political classes mouth platitudes and slogans and play race cards. And the way that you see the white liberals playing the race card left and right as just a way of getting these people's votes, and the way you see, we have to say it, don't we, the Democratic Party take these votes for granted, and so on. You don't believe in socialism. I'm sorry, Bob, but I believe that's an implication of what you're saying. You're a Christian. Again, I don't mean to out you, but I think that's very important to where you very, very important, okay? Here we are now, and I'll stop, all the way 2 decades into the 21st century. The civil rights movement ended in the 1960s or the 1970s at best. My God, if our people don't wake up, I'm talking about Black people and I'm talking about the American people, we are in for a very sad landing here, a very, very bad accounting. I think we're losing, Bob, notwithstanding your efforts. I want you to respond to that. I
agree with you, but you know, I don't have any choice but to be optimistic. Either that, I'll be found. There's no other way out. I have to believe it, because I have seen evidence of it every day. And as I go in these low-income communities, I see islands of excellence just shining. And my challenge is to excite the American public so we can ignite a kind of excitement, so that somebody with a lot of money and a lot of power will say, you know what, we are raising up inner city Black kids who are being told that they live in a country that hates them, and that such things as, what are the list that they have? Competition is racist. Capitalism is racist. They're being taught these. Can you imagine, after 8 years of this, these same young people are going to be asked to defend their country against foreign hostiles? Why would they do that if we're teaching them to be, that America hates them and therefore they should hate America? Also, Glenn, is having a practical problem that 60% of police forces are now having difficulty recruiting people, to the point where 911 calls are not being responded to. That's not something that's going to just adversely affect the Black community. So the race grievance industry is really contributing to the decline of this country and our ability to defend and protect ourselves. So for those who may not be motivated the way I am, your own self-interest ought to motivate you to begin to challenge what we are challenging in these times. So, I mean, I am convinced, I am hooked on optimism, because every time I go into these communities and I see my grassroots leaders achieving against the odds, I see some powerful examples of restoration and redemption. And I see safe people change and become transformed. I said, I want this for everybody. But there is a common thread, because it isn't just a matter of wealth, because as you know, in Silicon Valley, among the wealthy families where you have 2-parent households with master's degrees, a median income of $180,000, the teen suicide rate is 6 times the national average. And so therefore, and then that 17-year-old who, the mother who lost her 17-year-old daughter to suicide has more in common with the 17-year-old girl who was shot to death in public housing. One's problem isn't privilege and the other wasn't inequity. So in order for us to come together to fill that emptiness that is within the soul of people, we must push race aside. And so I'm hoping that people will do this for any number of reasons along the whole social and economic spectrum, either because it's threatening our public safety, either because there's an emptiness, a moral emptiness that must be filled. And we won't do it as long as we allow the race hustlers and extremists on both sides to prevail.
Okay, Bob, that's wonderful, man. I just want to underscore a few things you said, or maybe come back to touch on some points, because there's so much there. Uh, you're optimistic, okay, because you're seeing work on the ground that is giving you hope and inspiring you, and you believe in people. You're concerned about our public safety because you think that the message that's coming out of some of the critique of America, such as is exemplified by the 1619 Project, and by the way, as you know, this is the New York Times, this is the establishment of American culture. This is a massive infusion into a curriculum of schools all throughout this country in terms of how to tell the American story. This is a real fight about the American story, about the narrative, about how we understand the country. And in the context of that fight, you position yourself as a patriot. I'm sorry, but again, I don't know if you're going to deny that, you're going to run from that, because it sounds to me like it's a patriot. It sounds to me like 1776 is affirming something, okay? It sounds like believing in America, not just believing in grassroots people in the communities where you're working, believing in the country, perhaps believing that it's an exceptional country, but perhaps believing that it basically is a good country. Okay?
Absolutely.
Worth serving, excuse me, worth fighting and dying for. Okay, this is the implication that I'm taking out of what you're saying. Okay, Black people are not to be taught to hate our country. Why don't we just say that, okay? We ought not to be taught to hate our country. The fact of slavery, I'll say it for a third time, ought not redound in the 21st century in the indoctrination of our children into an attitude toward their country of contempt, of skepticism, of disdain, of not belonging. That's a mistake. It's a profound political and moral error. It betrays our ancestors. I want to finish this. Teaching our children that America isn't worth loving and dying for betrays the sacrifices of our ancestors who fought and died for it and for our freedom. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. If you look at all of my father was a veteran of the civil rights of the First World War. He fought with that New York division in Europe, and all of these wars that we have fought, there's never been a Black convicted of treason throughout that time. So for people today, you're betraying the sacrifices that they have made. In the Second World War, we said a double victory. We fought against fascism abroad and racism in the country. Yes, we are patriots, and these same principles of patriotism is what's making our grassroots leaders effective. Let me just read a little from Samuel Adams. He said, "A general dissolution of principles and manners will more surely overthrow the liberties of America than the whole force of a common enemy. While the people are virtuous, they cannot be subdued, but when they lose their virtue, they'll be ready to surrender their liberties to the first external or internal invader. Neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt." Our forebears understood that.
Okay, Bob, again, I want to interrupt you. I'm sorry. Duly noted. Profound point about the importance of value and integrity of family as the foundation for our liberty. Profound point. But I don't want to leave dangling the thing that we were talking about before about patriotism, because I want to anticipate the following response. You can't, you and Loury and Woodson, be asking us to be uncritical patriots. We are not being unpatriotic by being critical. We want the whole history, not just the prettified history. And so I want to go a step further, because there's a fight going on right now in the universities, in the political correct culture in terms of who makes movies and what gets on TV, in the political discourse about who gets a Democratic nomination and what do they say. What do you think about Black Lives Matter? Okay, I mean, I really mean that as a literal question to you, but I also mean it as a rhetorical question. The whole upswing of what I asked you about Malcolm X and you didn't answer. Malcolm X is now a more powerful icon in the imaginations of young Black people than is Martin Luther King Jr. I'm sorry, but that's just true. Okay, so I want to get this idea about critical. Do Black Americans have a prophetic witness to America? This is what Cornel West would say, whom I respect. Do we have a prophetic witness on the basis of our struggles and travails to throw up something profound? You're a moral man. Ben Barber is a moral man. I don't think you would deny that. He believes, I assume, that there's something in the experience of African Americans of a critical character that needs to be taken on board. If that were all they were trying to do at 1619, was to leaven the curriculum with some dimension of critical perspective, that would be one thing, but that's not all they're trying to do, okay? I allege that they are actually trying to subvert the narrative. We're gonna focus on Jefferson and Sally Hemings. We're not gonna focus on the Declaration. What's that? What's that? We're gonna make Lincoln into a racist. That's what Ava DuVernay did, practically. We're gonna make Lincoln into a racist. You can, where am I coming out? Where I'm coming out is I don't trust the motives of these people.
No.
I think they're far off in terms of their basic ideological foundation. And I think, the immigration issue is another issue that will bring this to the fore. Again, I don't expect you to take a position because you're being a politician on me, but it seems to me that your work has an implication for that.
Yeah, see what I'm worried about, because I want my grassroots leaders to understand that what has enabled them to become antibodies is the embrace of the American values of our founders. They are a living embodiment of everything that our founders said, Adams and others. They are a living embodiment of it. And people are motivated to change when they see victories that are possible, not just constantly remind them of injuries to be avoided. And also, my grassroots people teach by witnessing to those principles. And so, to me, a witness is more effective than an advocate. And so what we're trying to do at the 1770 Woodson Center is allow grassroots people to speak for themselves. These middle-class people like Nicole and the rest of them, Hannah Jones and others, they don't speak for the people that I represent. We need to allow these people to speak for themselves. And nothing undermines the moral authority of someone who advertises himself as an advocate for Black people, to have those same Black folks stand up and say, she does not represent me, nor does she speak for me. That's why what we're trying to do at 1776 is put a microphone and a camera in front of grassroots leaders who are living these redemptive values so that they can speak for themselves, and you will watch how the opposition will go away, as long as we have to be concerned about not only the message, but the messenger. And I know my grassroots people, what they're asking for is give them the tools, give them the opportunity to be civic teachers of their own peers, because thousands of grassroots people look to these indigenous leaders for leadership. They are the human capital that we need to process. So we're trying to put the information, the knowledge that someone like you have, Glenn, we need to put it into the hands of grassroots leaders so they can make the same point to their constituents as you're making to the general public.
There's a lot packed into there, all about a class stratified effort to authentically represent the interest of needy people. I think, it could be said that it may not be fair to say of a Hannah Jones or a Ta-Nehisi Coates or somebody like that they don't live in the ghetto. No, they don't live in the ghetto. Nobody who writes for newspapers and has books published and goes on TV lives in the ghetto. Almost nobody. It can't be that if you don't live there, you have no idea for or no right to speak for. There's all kinds of mediation that goes on in political life. So maybe it's a little bit of a cheap shot. But on the other hand, that they might propound policies that have very little to do with the lives of people, have more to do with their own celebrity or their own professional ambition than it has to do with practical problem solving. that they might be in a bubble, that they might be elitists who are disconnected from those people. And all of that certainly could be true. And I think it is, I think it actually is.
Well, let me make a quick point here.
Yeah, Bob, why don't you conclude? Because we're going on more than an hour. That's about the length of one of these conversations.
But I just want to make a point. It's not a matter of whether you live with somebody. You know, Jesus said you don't have to live with them, serve them. But the point is that they take positions of which they don't have to suffer the consequence of those positions. When you denigrate the police, for example, and call them occupiers, so that there is police nullification, so the police are not enforcing the laws equally. I remember 11 years ago, I wrote about this in Cincinnati, where Al Sharpton and the others came in when a white cop shot a teenager, you know, and they accused him of racism, so the police were less aggressive. The murder rate in the low-income areas of Cincinnati went up 800%, but not in the communities where the preachers and the civil rights people live. So then the people who were losing jobs from the boycott, who were waitresses and taxi drivers, they're saying, so my point is, I'm against people who advocate positions that have dire consequences for people, but that they don't have to suffer the same consequence as the people in whose name they're advocating. That's my point.
Yeah, Bob, thanks for making it. And I don't want to rush you off the stage. And I want to reiterate, I so much agree with what you're saying about public safety and low-income Black communities, about the role of the police in the creation of public safety, about the extent to which the political debate, and you are talking about Black Lives Matter, even though you're not naming them, and you're not just talking about Black Lives Matter.
I think they're horrible. They're the worst.
You're not just talking about them, you're talking about the entire liberal establishment, okay?
Exactly.
You're talking about the foundations in New York City that give away millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. You're talking about a political establishment that's centered in the Democratic Party. You're not talking about William Barr. I'm sorry, Bob. You're not talking about the Attorney General of the United States, because he gives speeches agreeing with what you just said. You're talking about the Democratic Party's position. You're talking about mothers of the movement. When Hillary Clinton brings these mothers onto the stage and they go through that thing, that's what you're talking about. And you're saying, it's costing Black lives. You're saying that people do not have to suffer the consequences of those costs who are advocating this. And you're saying that the legitimacy bestowed by the white establishment on these voices for Black people earns them condemnation, the establishment, the newspapers, the foundations, for riding their own political and ideological hobby horses on the backs of your people. They
are the real white supremacists.
I want us to end on that. We are not equivocating over here, okay? This is what we think, this is what we believe, this is what we're working for. Thank you, Bob, for coming on the Glenn Show.
And thank you, I'm honored, Glenn.